there weren't many disputes, you know, because we're writing like this, with acoustic guitars, and you know, I'm coming up with a bit of a line, and then he's following it on, just ping-ponging ideas. You know, I look back on it and think, yeah, you were a good collaborator. Yeah, you know, it was good. At the time, it just felt good, and we respected each other, you know.
Over the years, Lennon and McCartney have revealed who really wrote what, but some songs are still up for debate. Some songs were 50-50. I wanna hold your hand. Others with more weight from one of the two. Baby, you can drive my car. And others were entirely from one of them, although credited to the duo. The agreement was clear. Royalties would always be divided equally, even if the participation of one of them was only minimal. Although they never fought over money, there were several disputes over credit and actual participation in some songs. In this video, we bring you the 6 Beatles songs where John Lennon and Paul McCartney had disagreements over who did what.
The person I actually picked as my partner, who I recognized had talent and I could get on with, was Paul.
They began writing in 1958. The first song that Lennon and McCartney wrote together, according to Mark Lewison, was titled Too Bad About Sorrows. Lennon suggested that all songs written by either one of the pair, whether written individually or in a collaborative effort, should be credited to both of them. When the Beatles began their recording career, virtually every Lennon-McCartney original really was the joint endeavor of John and Paul, including all of their early singles, with the exception of Please Please Me. Some songs might have had a primary author who just needed help finishing them off, like McCartney with All My Loving, or Lennon on There's a Place. But the most famous and celebrated singles from the height of Beatlemania, She Loves You and I Want to Hold Your Hand, are genuine 50-50 compositions. By early 1964, though, things had already begun to change. McCartney wrote Can't Buy Me Love alone in a Paris hotel room while the band was touring France in January 1964. Lennon responded by writing 4 tracks for the record, totally on his own, including I Should Have Known Better and Tell Me Why, which ended up in the movie A Hard Day's Night. In the years that followed, Lennon and McCartney increasingly began to branch out in different directions with their songwriting. While they still honored their agreement to give joint credit to everything either of them wrote, McCartney wrote and recorded Yesterday entirely without Lennon's involvement. In turn, Lennon composed 4 of his 5 major contributions to the 1966 album Revolver without any help from McCartney. Despite this, up until 1969, the two continued to collaborate on at least 4 songs per Beatles album, even if it meant piecing together their respective unfinished ideas. However, it was clear that their partnership wasn't what it used to be. Between the aborted Get Back sessions and the release of Abbey Road, only 2 true joint Lennon-McCartney compositions were recorded. Their final collaboration was on Oh Darling, a largely McCartney-penned track written in the spring of 1969. In his 1980 Playboy magazine interview, he said of their working relationship, Paul proved the lightness and optimism, while I would always go for the sadness, the discords, the bluesy notes. There was a period when I thought I didn't write melodies, that Paul wrote those, and I just wrote straight shouting rock and roll. But of course, when I think of some of my own songs, in my life, or some of the early stuff, I was writing melody with the best of them. After the partnership had ended, Lennon and McCartney each gave various accounts of their individual contribution to each jointly credited song, and sometimes claimed full authorship. Often their memories of collaboration differed, and often their own early and late interviews are in conflict. There are 2 main sources on each Beatle talking about their contribution to each song. In 1972, Lennon offered Hit Parader a list of Beatles songs with comments regarding his and McCartney's contributions to each song, and he added more details in his 1980 Playboy interview. McCartney, on the other hand, talked about his songs and songwriting percentages on each track for the 1997 book Many Years From Now, and he gave some new details for 2021's The Lyrics. When I was younger, so much younger than today. Help broke paradigms in the pop world, expressing the feelings of a man tormented and depressed by a situation he is unable to understand and verify. Years later, John Lennon said that the feelings he captured in the song were real.
I mean, I go into these troughs every few years. It was less noticeable in the Beatles because the Beatles image and thing would carry you through it, you know. I mean, I was in the middle of a trough in Help, you know, but you can't see it really. I mean, I'm singing Help for a kickoff, you know, but it was less noticeable because you're protected by the image of the power of the Beatles.
The official version is that when Richard Lester authorized the title Help to the film, John Lennon began to compose it. When Paul arrived at Lennon's house to work on the song, it was almost finished, and he only suggested some arrangements. During 1965, John Lennon described the song as co-written, but over the years, both Lennon and McCartney changed their versions of how it was written and their involvement in the song. In the 70s, Lennon claimed full authorship of the song, and in the 80s, in 1984 to be precise, Paul said, "John and I wrote it at his house in Weybridge for the film." But in the 90s, Paul changed his version of the song again. First, in Anthology, he was not very clear about how the song came about.
And then I remember us all sort of sitting around trying to think of stuff, and I think Johnson went home and he came up with Dick Lester, I think we came up with the idea of Help. And then John went home and happened to write it that evening. Wait a minute. Hold on, that's wrong. John got the idea, I think, for the title Help. And I think from things he said later, I think it was a bit his state of mind. You know, he was feeling a bit constricted by the whole Beatle thing.
And in his 1997 authorized biography, McCartney said about Help, "I seem to remember Dick Lester, Brian Epstein, Walter Shinson, and ourselves sitting around. Maybe Victor Spinetti was there, and thinking, what are we going to call this one? Somehow Help came out. I didn't suggest it. John might have suggested it, or Dick Lester. It was one of them. John went home and thought about it, and got the basis of it. Then we had a writing session on it. We sat at his house and wrote it, so we obviously didn't have that much of it. I would have to credit it to John for original inspiration, 70-30. My main contribution is the counter melody to John. If you analyze our songs, John's are often on one note, whereas mine are often much more melodic. I enjoyed going places with melodies. I like what John did too, but his are more rhythmic. So to take away from the solo note a little bit, I wrote a descant to it.
How far do you feel that your individual talents are dependent upon each other? I mean, are you sort of Gilbert and Sullivan or Rodgers and Hammerstein? Do you need to work together as composers?
No, not really, but it helps a lot.
Just on the old maxim of two minds are better than one.
Yeah.
You get another point of view as well.
The thing is, because we can do them on our own, but often one of us will just do a song and there'll be, say, one verse in it that's very bad or something, and it's very corny, and if I've written it, then I'll sort of take it along and sing it to John. And he'll say, that verse is terrible and that verse is corny.
You still get so involved with something, you finish it, if you're on your own, you haven't got the energy to go over it and sort of see, if it really makes exactly what you want. So if you sing it over to each other, even if it's a finished song, with almost the arrangement, it's still sort of, yes, that's fine.
Eleanor Rigby is another one of the few songs in which years after its publication, John Lennon and Paul McCartney disputed the main authorship. McCartney came up with the melody for Eleanor Rigby as he experiments on his piano. Donovan recalled hearing McCartney play an early version of the song on guitar, where the character was named Olana Tungi. At this point, the song reflected an Indian musical influence, and its lyrics alluded to drug use, with references to blowing his mind in the dark and a pipe full of clay. Paul said that the idea to call his character Eleanor was possibly because of Eleanor Braun, the actress who starred with the Beatles in their 1965 film Help.
The dreaded sacred sacrificial ring of the dread Kaili.
Please say no more.
I can say no more.
And Rigby came from the name of a store in Bristol, Rigby and Evans Limited. McCartney wrote the melody and the first verse alone, after which he presented the song to the Beatles when they were gathered in the music room of John Lennon's home at Kenwood. Lennon, George Harrison, Ringo Starr, and Lennon's childhood friend Pete Shotton all listened to McCartney play his song through and contributed ideas. Harrison came up with the look at all the lonely people hook. Starr contributed the line, writing the words of a sermon that no one will hear, and suggested making Father McCartney darn his socks, which McCartney liked. It was then that Shotton suggested that McCartney change the name of the priest, in case the listeners mistook the fictional character for McCartney's own father. So, Paul took a phone book and went on from McCartney to Mackenzie.
Father Mackenzie, writing the words to a sermon that no one will hear.
But in 1972, Lennon said that he wrote 70% of the lyrics, but Pete Shotton remembered Lennon's contribution as being absolutely nil. In 1985, McCartney said that Lennon had contributed about half a line to the song, but elsewhere, including a 1966 interview, he describes finishing the song with more substantial collaboration with Lennon. According to journalist Hunter Davies, the last verse was finished with all the Beatles giving suggestions in the studio. 12 years later, in 1997, McCartney recalled writing the music to Eleanor Rigby at Jane Asher's family home in Wimpole Street, and then playing it to Donovan, who supported that the song lacked any serious lyrics at that point. In 2021, Paul added more context to the process of inspiration and songwriting. McCartney wrote that his inspiration for Eleanor Rigby was an old lady who lived alone and whom he got to know very well. He would go shopping for her and sit in her kitchen listening to stories and her crystal radio set. McCartney said, "Just hearing her stories enriched my soul and influenced the songs I would later write."
We think nearly alike, but pretty differently at the same time. But I mean, we can write a song, say like Day Tripper, where we've got to write one, and at the same time be the same writing it. We can write it thinking the same thing about it. But if we each wrote it individually, it'd be a completely different song.
Talking about Ticket to Ride, in 1965, Lennon claimed that the song was 3/4 mine, and Paul changed it a bit. He said, "Let's alter the tune." But in 1980, Lennon changed his mind, saying that McCartney's contribution was limited to the way Ringo Starr played the drums. Paul responds, "John just didn't take the time to explain that we sat down together and worked on that song for a full 3-hour songwriting session. And at the end of it all, we had all the words, we had the harmonies, and we had all the little bits." Claiming credit, Paul said of the song in 1997 for his book, Many Years From Now, "We sat down and wrote it together. I remember talking about Ride, but it was John's thing. We wrote the melody together. You can hear on the record, John's taking the melody and I'm singing harmony with it. We'd often work those out as we wrote them. Because John sang it, you might have to give him 60% of it. It was pretty much a work job that turned out quite well. I think the interesting thing was a crazy ending. Instead of ending like the previous verse, we changed the tempo. My baby don't care. My baby don't care. We picked up one of the lines, "My baby don't care," but completely altered the melody. We almost invented the idea of a new bit of song on the fade out with this song. It was something specially written for the fade out, which was very effective, but it was quite cheeky, and we did a fast in it. It was quite radical at the time.
There are places I remember.
Eleanor Rigby and In My Life are the two biggest disagreements between the two composers. Paul said in 1997 about this, "I find it very gratifying that out of everything we wrote, we only appear to disagree over 2 songs. I'll give my memories of writing In My Life. I arrived at John's house for a writing session, and he had the very nice opening stanzas of the song. As many of our songs were, it was the first pangs of nostalgia for Liverpool. Not that we longed to return there, but like everyone, you look at your youth, as Maharishi used to say, through a golden glass, and it looks much better than it was. Remember those times when we used to walk with guitars and strum at night? And they were good, but they sound much better in retrospect. It was just walking along the street with the guitar. Once the Beatles had happened, us 2 little waifs, walking along, strumming quite openly on the street, suddenly becomes a romantic legend, something they would definitely not miss in a film. That was what John had. But as I recall, he didn't have a tune to it, and my recollection, I think, is at variance with John's. I said, "Well, you haven't got a tune. Let me just go on and work on it." And I went down to the half landing, where John had a mellotron, and I sat there and put together a tune based in my mind on Smokey Robinson and the Miracles. Songs like "You've Really Got a Hold on Me" and "Tears of a Clown" had really been a big influence. You refer back to something you've loved and try and take the spirit of that and write something new. So I recall writing the whole melody, and it actually does sound very like me if you analyze it. I was obviously working the lyrics. The melody structure is very me. So, my recollection is saying to John, "Just go and have a cup of tea or something. Let me be with this for 10 minutes on my own and I'll do it." And with the inspiration of Smokey and the Miracles, I tried to keep it melodic, but a bit bluesy, with the minors and little harmonies. And then my recollection is going back up into the room and saying, "Got it. Great. Good tune, I think. What do you think?" John said nice, and we continued working with it from then, using that melody and filling out the rest of the verse. As usual, for these co-written things, he often just had the first verse, which was always enough. It was the direction, it was the signposts, and it was the inspiration for the whole song. I hate the word, but it was the template. We wrote it, and in my memory, we tagged on the introduction, which I think I thought up. I was imagining the intro of a Miracles record, and to my mind, the phrases on guitar are very much Smokey and the Miracles. So it was John's original inspiration. I think my melody, I think my guitar riff. I don't want to be categorical about this, but that's my recollection. We then finished it off, and it was a fine song which John sang. John told Playboy, "Paul helped me write the middle 8 melody. The whole lyrics were already written before Paul even heard it. In My Life, his contribution melodically was the harmony and the middle 8 itself." An existing manuscript of an early version shows that the lyrics went through a tremendous number of changes, with very few lines remaining from the original text. Commenting on Paul's claim to have written music, the musicologist Ian MacDonald observes in Revolution in the Head, "Its angular verticality, spanning an entire octave and typically wide and difficult leaps, certainly shows more of his touch than Lennon's, despite fitting the latter's voice snugly. There are a couple of other minor disagreements." McCartney claimed to have helped on the lyric, estimating the song as 80-20 to Lennon, but in Hit Parader, Lennon did not acknowledge any contributions from McCartney. In Hit Parader, Lennon said he authored the song and took the words from a circus poster. He did not acknowledge McCartney as a contributor. In 2013, McCartney recalled spending an afternoon with Lennon writing the song based on the poster. I read, "Occasionally, people say, 'Oh, John wrote that one.' I say, 'Wait a minute. What was that afternoon I spent with him then, looking at this poster?'" Another dispute was over songwriting credits. The Beatles released their first single, "Love Me Do," credited to Lennon and McCartney. However, on their next 3 releases the following year, the credit was given as McCartney-Lennon. According to McCartney, the decision to consistently order the credit with Lennon first was made at an April 1963 band meeting. With the "She Loves You" single, released in August 1963, the credit reverted to Lennon McCartney, and all subsequent official Beatles singles and albums list Lennon McCartney in UK or John Lennon, Paul McCartney in the US as the author of the songs written by the two. In 1976, McCartney's band Wings released their live album, Wings Over America, with songwriting credits for 5 Beatles songs reversed to place McCartney's name first. Neither Lennon nor his wife Yoko Ono publicly objected to the flipped credits at the time. Many years after Lennon's death, however, in the late 1990s, McCartney and Ono became involved in a dispute over the credit order. McCartney's 2002 live album, Back in the US, also used the credit Paul McCartney and John Lennon for all the Beatles songs. When Ono objected to McCartney's request for the reverse credit to be used for the 1965 song Yesterday, McCartney said that he and Lennon had agreed in the past that the credits could be reversed if either of them wanted to on any future releases. In 2003, he relented, saying, "I'm happy with the way it is, and always has been. Lennon and McCartney is still the rock and roll trademark I'm proud to be a part of, in the order it always has been." Subsequent Paul McCartney live albums, Good Evening New York City and Amoeba Gig, featured original credits to Lennon and McCartney songs, but the new Paul McCartney and Wings live in the studio album, One Hand Clapping of 2024, featured reverted credits to the Beatles songs.
We just got a very informal approach. We've got no formula at all, for writing songs. We just do it as it happens. Sometimes John can write a line of a song. He can come up and say, things like that. He could just say that to me, and I could say, "No, John." And often I disagree with Paul and say, "Which has been done so many times, it's killed it." But then sometimes, we have a real row, and I say, "Listen here, John, I don't think that's right." But it depends, sometimes there's a line that he does, and then I do a line, or sometimes John can write a whole song. Can I? Yes, he's a wonder when he gets going. Sometimes I can even do that.
In the modern music industry, things work quite differently. Today, credits are often meticulously divided between lyricists, composers, producers, beatmakers, and even contributors to a single line or idea. Back then, songwriting partnerships like George and Eric Gershwin, Rodgers and Hammerstein, or Elton John and Bernie Taupin relied on a clear division. One wrote the lyrics, the other the music. But Lennon and McCartney were a different kind of duo. Both wrote lyrics, both composed melodies. Especially in the early years, they wrote face to face, as Lennon once said. Later on, their collaborations became more fragmented, with each often composing separately, yet the joint credit remained, honoring a pact they made before fame ever reached them. But as the years passed, and with the wild life they lived, the drugs, the fame, the chaos, memory becomes tricky. Some recollections fade or twist, Others are reshaped to fit the narrative of later interviews. If the Beatles had emerged today, perhaps the Lennon and McCartney label would have been subdivided even further. After all, George Harrison, Ringo Starr, George Martin, and their entire circle undeniably left fingerprints on the music. In today's terms, they might be co-writers too. But then again, maybe that's the beauty of it. A myth made of melodies, egos, harmonies, and contradictions. What do you think?
When we started doing them, we started apart from each other. You know, John had written one and I'd written one, I think. And then we just happened to start writing them together, you know. And then I think the reason, for instance, that George didn't write any was that he thought that it was just that we could write the songs and that the other two couldn't. And Ringo still thinks it, I think. But I think anyone can write songs, probably.
Well, you find out that you can, you know, gonna carry on writing them and they are going to come or not, you know. It just goes on forever and you never get a tune, well, then give up.
There's some words that we use all the time. You know, for rhymes and things, if you're stuck, there's always you and new and things.
And day. And
day, you know.
And
you find yourself doing those. You find yourself doing them, and they're probably hackneyed